Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Clinton Neurotech.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is actually somebody I've been in contact with for a while. It's Doug Clinton of Loup Ventures, and he is basically in the field of venture capital. Basically what this is, if you haven't seen the TV show Silicon Valley, I highly recommend that you watch it because it's surprisingly informative. It's really funny. It's supposed to be comedy, but it hits the nail on the head with a lot of problems that people in Silicon Valley have with investors, investing, and all the characters that are usually involved in this kind of thing. Anyways, he does touch on this a little bit, but also we talk about what venture capital means, what it can be good for, what they look for when they want to invest in a company, basically a neurotech company. They really like the neuroscience field and have recently invested in former guest Matt Engel of Paradromics, and I think they have a really good future. So hopefully you will have found this as interesting as I have, and we'll talk more on the other side. Cool. Pleasure to have you on the show. It's really interesting. I haven't had any financial people on, and venture capital is something that I'm really interested in. I mean, especially even before the show Silicon Valley, it's something that I've been really interested in. And so I'm really fascinated about talking to somebody with kind of an eye towards the startup side of things, the growth potential side of companies. So how similar is what you do to Silicon Valley?
Well, first I'll say thanks for having me on. Yeah, Silicon Valley feels like this generation's Wall Street. I remember Gordon Gekko was such an icon for, I think, a lot of financiers in the 80s and the 90s, and now we have Wall Street.
Wait, do you have a car phone?
Yeah, I remember back in the day, my parents had a car phone. It was like a huge, black leather bag case phone, and you had to keep it plugged in the car all the time or it didn't work. It's funny how quickly things have changed. But yeah, in terms of Silicon Valley, the show versus the real Silicon Valley, there's some similarities. There's definitely a lot of personalities for sure in real life as there are in the show. But I think, in reality, what we're trying to do as venture capitalists is find really interesting companies that are founded by great founders that are trying to build interesting products. And there's a lot of companies out there to look at. And, some of them end up breaking through and building really interesting things. What we in particular focus on investing in are sort of frontier tech companies is how we categorize it. So things that are really on the cutting edge. And for us, it really is two categories. There's autonomy and there's experience. And so autonomy is things like AI, machine learning, self-driving vehicles, all those themes that everybody is really super excited about. And then the experience side are things like augmented and virtual reality, it's things like gaming. And then the reason I'm on the show, I think, is it's things like neurotech. That's a big component, I think, of experience in the future. And so, neurotech is something I think as sort of a venture group, it's maybe been a little bit underrepresented over the last few years. I think there's starting to be some excitement around possibility in neurotechnology, but that's a space that we have been excited about and continue to be excited about.
Yeah, that's really interesting because kind of what you're saying, when you think about venture capital, you think about more these tech companies, these kind of the Instagram style, fastest billion-dollar company in history, right? And that probably is because the turnaround can be so good, it was so fast because you can build users very quickly. It's free to scale more or less, but neurotech has this, I guess regulatory part of things, and it's much slower. So why are you guys deciding to get into it? Because the time horizon isn't, 1 or 2 years or 5 years or something like this. It could be even 10 years. Is that a problem for you guys?
It's something that we think a lot about. And part of our investment thesis is that we want to invest in things that are good for the world, that the world needs. And so, social media apps, they can be good for the world. Do we need another social media app? I mean, everybody has this debate, probably not. And I think as we see things in neurotechnology, there are things that are solving what we probably thought of as unsolvable problems 5 or 10 years ago. There's solutions to potentially chronic pain. There's solutions to paralysis, blindness, deafness. These are things that, all sort of manifest themselves in many ways in the circuitry of the brain. And to the extent that we can understand that and manipulate that, we can solve these tremendous problems. And in our minds, like investing for the long term to solve those huge problems should come with huge financial benefit as well. And so that's sort of, why we're excited about investing in them. I also think that even though it may take 5 and 10 and maybe even longer years to reach some of these ultimate product launches or solutions, in the near term, I think companies that are involved in the space, large companies, whether they're tech companies like Google or Facebook, or they're pharma companies like Bayer or Merck, I think they'll realize how important the neurotech space is becoming, and they'll have to make investments in this space as well and acquire some of these companies. So, the exit path might not be, 20 years, but I think there'll be some nearer term exits because of that.
Is there a reason that neuroscience or neurotech is big right now? Like why, especially now, 2018, do you think that it's growing? And what factors are there that are allowing this, whereas it didn't exist maybe 5 years ago?
I think if we think about like venture-backed technology just broadly over the last 20, 25 years, we've been investing in the internet, it feels like forever. And the smartphone now, we're 10 plus years into the smartphone. And typically these waves, they seem to last really 10 to 15 years. So in the 80s, we had the PC. In the 90s, we had the internet. In the 2000s, we had the smartphone. And so I think the intuition is, what is going to be that next wave? Because the longer we sort of live in these cycles, less opportunities sort of present themselves in it. I think everyone's obviously very excited about AI. That feels sort of consensus now. And so I think to the extent that venture capitalists are looking for sort of alpha, looking for things that are non-consensus, things like neurotechnology, which are a little bit more under the radar, I think become more exciting. So I think that's why there's sort of this surge of interest kind of more near term in the space.
So you're saying that AI will allow neurotech to become even better, that will be kind of the gas that will allow neurotech to explode?
I think AI can be the gas for a lot of different things to explode, really. I think to the extent that we can apply machine intelligence to data that we've collected and is not usable from like sort of a human scale, a manual scale, I think AI can accelerate, any project, neuroscience projects included. And it seems like most of the doctors that we have spoken to at some level use some sort of machine learning or other AI methods to sort of enhance their research, or even some of the research is based primarily on those methods. So I think it's definitely a component of it too.
And what about the regulation side of things? I mean, a lot of these medical devices cost millions of dollars just to get through FDA approval. And that's if you're lucky, it can be 10 million, 100 million, something like this. So do you see it just as cost of doing business, or can that be a detriment, especially if that adds like 3 years to the time that a product takes to launch?
I would say two things there. One is I think there's a lot of exciting things going on in neuroscience that aren't necessarily going to be FDA approved projects. So one company we're invested in, Neurable, they're a non-invasive EEG-based computer interface control system. And so, a project like that, obviously there's no FDA mandate on that particular domain. They can go and they're primarily focused on sort of VR and AR right now, and leveraging the brainwave signals to control interactions in those devices. And there's other companies like Control Labs and others that are, I think, experimenting with similar spaces. So there's definitely investment to be done that avoids the FDA. In terms of things that do need FDA approval, I think in some ways it's a double-edged sword, right? Like it does add cost to the entire process. It certainly adds uncertainty. It adds risk to the investment. But at the same time, if the company is able to develop a good product that does go through an FDA approval process, that process then becomes a moat that other companies then, would have to go through if they were ever to try to compete with that. So, depending on how you want to look at sort of that reality of the situation, I think we see it as sort of a necessary component of building some of these life-changing, game-changing technologies. And I think it can be an advantage when you turn it into a moat, sort of in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. Then the other side is right for the picking. So I guess feel free to answer this how you want, or not answer it at all. But you guys recently announced funding Paradromics, which Matt Engel was a previous guest, and they have the 10,000 channel count, brain implants, very cool stuff. I was impressed by the talk and everything like this. So I would have invested in them. But what did you see about them that was, exciting for you that you're like, okay, we're going to put our money where our mouth is and actually support them?
I think we saw, great, ambitious team. I was really impressed just by Matt, his thoughtfulness around the space and what he wants to build. I think when you're doing early stage investments, the first thing that you're always looking for is a great team, because so many things can go wrong for an early stage company. If you don't get the team right, everything's going to go wrong is sort of a rule of thumb. And I think the team really sort of compelled us to get excited about the story. And then from a technology standpoint, I think the paradigm shift from what we have today with a 100 channel count sort of Utah array going to potentially 10,000 plus channel count device from Paradromics, like what you can do with that, it's such a drastic difference. Like I don't even know if we know what we can do with that much more information coming off the brain. And so I think for us, like that big of a leap forward was a meaningful part of the story. If they were just, doubling channel count or something like that, it probably wouldn't have been as exciting. You don't get as much of a benefit. But I think to the extent that they are really trying to drive a meaningful innovation forward in the sort of neural implant space, that was a really important.
Yeah, definitely. Silicon Valley is all about the 10x improvement. And in this case, it was 100x improvement. So that must have gotten you guys really excited, right? But you guys, you talk about teams, being important. And I've always heard that this is so that if you need to pivot, if you need to actually change your business plan, that you have a capable team who's ready to do this. But in this case, it seems like it's not as easy to pivot a hardware company versus a software company. Like, how do you reconcile that, I guess?
Yeah, I would say one thing I'm just replaying the conversation in my head. I think I said 10,000 channel count. Paradromics actually 65,000 channel count. So it's 200 or 650 times better just to get the scale right, the scope right. But yeah, just in terms of pivoting, certainly I think when you're building a hardware-based solution, it does make it a little bit more difficult to pivot. Hardware is expensive. Hardware is hard, as everyone says. But almost every hardware company is also developing software. And so I think that to the extent that the hardware, for whatever reason, fails, if there is valuable insight and IP built around the software, I think there's always the potential for that to enable a pivot. Like I said, we're betting on a team first. And I think great teams find ways to make things happen. And whether they're a hardware-based or software-based company, like there's always different challenges that are associated with your domain. But I think to the extent you can find a great team, they'll find a way to survive and turn something into nothing.
What does that mean, good team? I mean, you've mentioned this a few times, but I don't really understand what it means. Like, are there classes I can take to become a better team member, or where do I sign up? Like, do I just go to the gym and like lift? I don't know, whatever.
I wish it was that easy. Yeah, I think Y Combinator is probably like the first answer is how to become a great entrepreneur. They've sort of systematized, it seems like, the whole process. The great team, it's really hard to define. Like, we've built some of our own logic around it. I think different VCs define different VCs define great teams differently, just by nature of different VCs invest in different teams and they pass on things that other VCs invest in. And so, defining a great team, I think part of it is art and part of it's science. We try to find people that are domain experts in whatever they're building, that have some unique insight on the market that others don't have yet. We try to find people that can compel others to come work for them. I mean, that's a big part of building a team is the ability to hire and get people excited about what you're building. So there's kind of a lot of soft skills that I think sort of add up to what it means to be a great leader that creates a great team.
So you need to have both the hard skills, the science background, and the soft skills, the interpersonal skills, where you can manage a group of people, something like this.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And actually, maybe I don't know if we really explained what a venture capitalist is. Like, you're the money fairy, mm-hmm. right? You're handing out buckets full of money to people. And in which cases is it a good idea to take money from a venture capitalist, and when it is not? Because it can be very expensive.
So yeah, venture capitalist, I like the money fairy. It should be our new tagline. So yeah, we basically look for early stage companies. So early stage means anything from one person building a prototype in their garage, or it could be in the case of neuroscience, an academic researcher that has explored a very specific domain related to neuroscience, and they think they've got a product idea coming out of that, to 5 people that have, built a software product or a hardware product or whatever. So small teams, early stage, and we write checks of a certain amount of money to buy a part of their company. So usually we'll write checks of $300,000 to $500,000 for the most part. And we try to buy a small percentage of the company that we invest in. And so when it's good or when it's not good to kind of seek venture capital, I think, it starts with probably the intention of the idea. If you want to build a really big company, you've got what you think is a really big idea, That's the first hurdle. Venture capitalists only want to invest in things that can be profound in terms of their impact, so they're not going to want to invest in a restaurant down the street. Not that that'd be relevant for a neuroscience podcast, but to put it in scope, most small businesses are not things that would fit the venture capital paradigm. So having a big idea, big vision is first. I think the second thing is assembling a team and having very thoroughly thought through what your initial product is that you want to bring to market. So the point of any early stage venture capital investment, so like your first money in, the first money that you raise as a company, will go toward what's called product market fit. So you'll want to have a very specific idea for a product you want to build, and then a plan to take that product and actually go into the market and get feedback from customers to define whether or not there's demand for the product. And so that can look like very many different things. If you're, Facebook, it's easy. It's not easy, but theoretically it's easy. You go out and you try to find as many users as possible. Yeah. Simpler than building a neural interface, I guess. But you just try to find as many users as possible. You get that feedback. If you've got great user growth, then venture capitalists are probably going to want to continue to fund you. For a neuroscience-based startup, it's probably much more technically driven. So you're probably, going into market, you've got a very basic framework in terms of a hardware product you want to build, or maybe some integrated hardware and software solution. And the point of the venture capital will be to sort of take you from, nothing or this framework to an actual working prototype, or something that you might sell into academic research labs where you don't need FDA approval. And so, it looks different company to company, but that's sort of the general point of what you should raise venture capital for and the kinds of projects that you should raise it for.
Okay, so if you have like a revolutionary technology and banks don't want to give you money, you can't get grants for it, then you can come to, venture capital and they'll be able to fund you if you can convince them to give you $500,000.
Sure, exactly. Yeah, that's the hardest part.
So yeah, actually, that is a good question. Like, how many offers hit your desk, and how many pitches do you get, and then what percentage convert to a paycheck, or how many like deals fall through that looked good? I'm very curious to hear some of your numbers for this.
Yeah, it's a fun question to answer.
As detailed as you want to get without revealing trade secrets.
Sure. Yeah, no, this is free to speak on these. These are easy. We usually see things that cross our desk, a few thousand different opportunities a year. So it's a lot of things. We generally take that, top of the funnel and whittle it down to roughly 500 startups, maybe a little more, where we do an initial call. We talk to the entrepreneur. We may meet them in person, and we start sort of a high-level diligence process. For the most part, that first meeting is just about assessing the founder. Like, is this a good founder? Is this a good team? And maybe a little bit less about the idea and more of the people first. From that 500, we actually invest in about 10 to 12 companies. So our hit rate's about 1 to 2%, I think, is the right number there. So it's extremely low. And venture capital, I think, it's a hard business in the sense that you have to tell people no a lot, and telling people no is hard. But it's worse to just not say anything, a lot of venture capitalists, we've been told at least, they'll meet with a company and then just never respond because they don't want to say no. They're worried to say no. So we just have a policy that as much as we can, and I'm sure companies fall through the cracks, but we always try to get back with feedback that's helpful, especially when it isn't no. Thinking about the funnel, it's amazing to think about how many different companies we see, and even the few thousand that we see, that's just a very small subset of the actual number of companies that get founded. So you always think about the ones that you miss or you never see. It's incredible how many startups get founded every year and how few actually sort of go through the venture capital process.
Yeah. You might know this a little bit, like how many venture capital companies are there? And then, obviously a majority are invested more into the tech, the Facebook kind of style things. And how many do you think are in the neuroscience or neurotechnology side of things?
In terms of the number of companies, I'm not sure. It's a little bit difficult because there's so many different stages that companies invest in. So you've probably heard of funds like Founders Fund, which is Peter Thiel's fund, or Andreessen Horowitz with Mark Andreessen, really high-level brand name funds, Kleiner Perkins. And those companies, they have such large funds. They've got $1 billion plus under management for the most part. So they're only investing for the most part in companies that are much later stage than where we would look. So they're trying to put, tens or maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases to work at a time in an investment. We are looking obviously at much smaller companies putting in much smaller checks much earlier. So the number of funds, I mean, there's probably hundreds of different venture capital funds, if not thousands in the US right now, and billions of dollars sort of under management in aggregate across those funds. So it's a pretty huge industry. It's obviously a lot smaller than the public markets, but, it is pretty tremendous. And then in terms of neuroscience focus, the one that pops to mind is Jazz Ventures. They, I know, have always had a very sort of neuroscience focused underpinning from when they started the fund. I think they're a super smart team. What we have been seeing is that traditional venture capitalists, people like the Kleiner Perkins, who are known for funding technology companies, traditional technology companies, they've actually become much more active in the neuroscience space. So there are obviously neuroscience focused funds, but I think these big funds too are seeing the opportunity and are trying to build expertise around it as well and sort of dabbling as they see things that fit their sort of check criteria.
Do you think some of this may be affected by things like Elon Musk, starting Neuralink, and Brian Johnson starting Kernel, both of these like tech billionaires, and they're putting their money behind it? Do you think that might be catching people's attention?
I think it probably is. Yeah, it's one thing that's exciting for us as investors in Paradromics. I mean, obviously, the three of them are probably the companies that are furthest along in sort of these, in terms of these super high bandwidth neural interfaces. And so, Brian Johnson's company, I believe, is pretty much funded right now just with his own money. I know there's been reports about Neuralink raising some small amount of money that it may just end up being mostly Elon's money for now too. So I think they have actually shown a light that this is a really interesting space to think about and invest in. And I think they approach it much more from the sort of context of evolution of humanity, a little bit less on, I think, the clinical side. So more like, okay, how do humans compete with AI? The neural interface is a component of maintaining the relevance of humanity as AI improves. But I think that, Paradromics' focus is probably a little bit more near term in terms of finding clinical applications. And then obviously the sort of neural interface for augmentation is a really interesting, future potential application.
Okay. And in terms of future applications, I've been talking to you about this over email for some time and through Avery Beddoes, who is a blogger at The Substrate. What's your opinion on bioelectronic medicine?
You're the one who really enlightened me on the potential for it. We're really excited about it. We had the great fortune to meet with some people at the Feinstein Institute a couple of weeks ago, and they shared with us some of the things that are going on there. I think it's a really interesting space. And one of the insights I think we learned was sometimes when traditional pharmaceutical treatments fail, it's that they're just not able to target the sort of malady in the same way that a vagus nerve stimulation device might. And so for some people who they have no way of relief, even the traditional methods we use today, they're ineffective. Helping people that have no possibility for relief, I think, is really profound. And then the thought that maybe in the future, everyone might have, some sort of neurostim device that might serve multiple functions, right? It might help with depression. It might help with pain management. It might help with something else. Maybe it is the future where we don't need pharmaceuticals if it's effective across all these domains. I think that's really exciting. I think it's really kind of fun to think about, not just like the memory augmentation and sort of a lot of the things we think with Neuralink and Kernel, but also the physical augmentation that can happen with these neural implants.
Definitely, yeah, that's what I'm excited about as well, and I really hope it goes through. You have a podcast as well, and I was a little bit like, not jealous, this is my turf, because you're also talking about neuroscience, but I really like it because, it gives another perspective. Do you want to talk about your show and what you talk about and who you talk to?
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's fun, and thank you too you've made a lot of really great introductions. We've had some fun guests on that you've introduced us to. So yeah, we have a podcast. It's called the Loup Ventures Neurotech Podcast. I think we talk about things, a little bit more from sort of the business end, the investment end, like what are the near-term opportunities in neuroscience? What are the things that some of these academic researchers and doctors are working on today? And how does that come to market sort of in the near term? So yeah, we've been doing it. I think we're only maybe 11 or 12 episodes in. So we've got a long way to go to catch you, but we're going to keep trying to, help inform sort of the investor community about why this is such a great opportunity to invest.
Yeah, for sure. And I have a request too, like a listener request. You got to show more of like the backdoor, I don't know, like dealings or thinking behind it, the kind of the water cooler talk. And Anderson Horowitz, A16Z podcast does this. And there's a new show on Gimlet podcast. It's called The Pitch. And they talk about this kind of stuff. So it's really enlightening, because I think by doing stuff like this, you can educate the public, educate your future investors, not investors, your future pitchees or your future companies that are pitching to you, and make them better and kind of train them, even at year 2, 5 before they come to you. And that way they're that much better. They've gone to the gym, right? They've trained to look good. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to mention?
I think we hit everything. I think just, the thing that I would leave on is that, sometimes I think when we tell people what we invest in and we talk about, neuroscience and we talk about neural implants, sometimes there's like this fear reaction, a little bit like robots. Like people, I think they're probably less afraid of robots now because they've gotten used to the idea. But sometimes it's like this, you're gonna, plug your brain into the internet. Like they don't really get it. And I think that's natural for every new technology. And so I think to the extent that, you continue to educate the public through your podcast and we do the same, part of it is I think helping people understand why these technologies are not threatening, why they're actually really, really exciting, and to control sort of, or at least refine that message around how they think about it, how they talk about it. Because I think they should be excited about the future we're building in the neurotech space, because I think it'll be great for everyone. Everyone should benefit from it.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, like you said, it's a kind of an exposure therapy. And if they start to see it like, oh, grandma has it to reduce her arthritis, then you slowly get acclimatized to it, and it's not nearly as scary as it once was. And then later when it's Twitter for the brain, then it's like, oh yeah, that's just like a half a step further.
Yeah, makes it easy.
Okay, Doug, this has been very pleasant, and I know we'll be talking tons more in the future.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me on, Len.
Thank you. Hey guys, hopefully you enjoyed it. I really liked it. I like Doug on a personal level, and it was really nice to be able to talk to him. Actually, this is the first time that we saw each other. We've talked a few times, but I really like what they're doing because I didn't really know. I mean, I like the Silicon Valley, startup scene and everything like this, and I follow a lot of podcasts and stories from there, but I never really knew that it was possible to have kind of this longer cycle thing like neuroscience, neurotech, and medical devices be funded by venture capital. Because as I said in the episode, basically it's usually along the lines of, they want something within a year or two, maybe 5 years that is completely ready, mature, and ready to sell the company. So it's very, I guess, refreshing to see a company actually that is more willing to wait longer and to wait potentially the 10 years, the 15 years, 20 years for something to be fully mature. So hopefully you guys have enjoyed it. If you are starting a company or are looking in terms of funding, sources of funding and everything like this could be a good for you. It might not be. It can be very expensive. So if you plan for your company to be wealthy and filthy rich, then, they might take like a 10% stake for, I don't know, 500,000 or something like this. But basically what that means is after 10 years, when your company's worth $1 billion, that 500,000 that they put in is now worth, $1 billion. Now that 10% stake is worth 100 million. So they've basically turned $500,000 into 100 million. And so it can be very expensive for that. If you can, just get a bank loan. That $500,000 loan would turn into, I don't know, 580,000 or something like this. So it's much cheaper in that case, but sometimes you need it, and sometimes the banks don't give you money. And so they're the ones that are willing to risk a lot of money because a lot of times it fails, but they only go after the ones that show promise. So really like what they're doing, and keep an eye out on them. Check out the podcast, the Loop Neurotech reports, and I like it. I'm subscribed to them. They have another one as well, which is more on Loop, like the general investment strategy and what they're talking about, everything like this. They talk about VR and tech and everything like this, kind of what Doug mentioned in the podcast as well. And I find this as well. They used to focus a lot on Apple and Apple stocks and what Apple's going to be doing, and that was really interesting because they were pretty accurate actually. They had I guess one big failure or something like this, but in the end, they were just ahead of the curve by a few years, and it was just a question of like, oh, management changed their mind on something, but in the end, they did implement a feature or something that Loup had predicted. So, they got a pretty good track record, and they are somebody that you should keep on looking out for. So hopefully you enjoyed it and enjoyed my ramblings as well. And until next time, this is the Neural Implant Podcast, and my name is Ladin. And hopefully you enjoy this. See ya.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.